Hello my friends, welcome back. I have a story for you today. It's called Six Swans and it's from the folkloric tradition of Europe. It was first collected by the Brothers Grimm in Germany in the 19th century, but the roots of this story go way, way, way back, and there are versions of this story all over Europe and beyond. If you're familiar with Irish mythology, you might be familiar with the story of the Children of Lir, and this is a very similar story, so a sign it's very, very old. As I've said on this channel before, my friends, I'm of the opinion that these so-called fairy tales are not meant to be moralistic lessons for children or entertainment on a dark winter's night. No, I believe these are part of our shamanic ancestral heritage, and they contain great medicine within them that helps put any difficulties that we are having in our lives into a greater mythic context. And that medicine worked then, and it works now. So pay attention when you're hearing this story, and if any images particularly resonate with you, then sit with that for a while, and do, if you feel up to it, let me know in the comments, because I'll be interested to know. Long ago, long ago, there was a king. And that king, my friends, exists inside each and every one of you. Now, that king one day was out hunting. He was riding in the great wild forest that existed on the edge of his kingdom. And just like always happens in so many of these stories, a deer burst from a thicket, and the king and all the king's men gave chase, chasing through the wild tangle of forest. And that king, he got so hot in the chase that it seemed like the whole hunt became a blur, and there was just that king and the forest and the deer. And he suddenly realized that he had left all his retinue behind him, and that deer had escaped, and he was suddenly completely, utterly lost. This, my friends, is not a very kingly position to be in. The sovereign should not get lost in the woods. Well, he looked about this way, he looked about that way. It was almost as if the forest trail had closed up behind him. Now, the light was beginning to fade, and that king began to get a little bit frightened. He was starting to wonder if he would ever find his way back to his palace, his fire, and his bed. It was at that moment, in the gloaming, in the half-light, in the hinge of the day, between day and night, that a little old woman came emerging out of the woodland. And the story says she had a bobbing head. There's often an old witchy kind of woman with a bobbing head in these stories. I'm sure you know one. Now this witch, because a witch she was, addressed the king and said, "Your Majesty, I will lead you out of this forest on one condition. You will marry my daughter and make her your queen. And she's very pretty." Well, the king, starting to suspect that this old woman before him had more than a little to do with the situation he now found himself in, had no choice but to agree. And he followed that old woman back to her hut in the forest. And the forest just seemed to open up and let them both pass and then seal up again behind them. Inside that old woman's hut, there was a fire crackling in the hearth, and sat on a stool by the fire, as if she was waiting for them, was a beautiful young woman. And she looked up and smiled when the king entered. And though she was very beautiful, something about that smile chilled the king's heart. But, as I said before, he had no choice. So the next day, the witch's daughter got on the back of the king's horse, and back he went to the palace. And it was as if the pathways of the forest just opened up again, and he rode back to the castle to great celebration. You see, the king, His wife had died some years before, and all the courtiers were trying to make the king get remarried, but he loved his old wife so much he was unwilling to do so. And here he comes riding out of the forest with this beautiful young woman and proclaimed that she would be the queen. Now the new queen was crowned. The whole kingdom was in a state of jubilation, but the king, he was very, very, very concerned. You see, he had 7 children from his previous marriage. 6 sons. They were like lion cubs, and 1 daughter. Now the king, he did not trust his new bride. You cannot blame him given the circumstances of their betrothal. So, what the king did was squirrel his 7 children away in a tower deep, deep, deep in that enchanted, magical, ever-changing forest. Exiled the children into the woods where they would be safe. But he would go and visit them every once in a while, maybe once in a week. And in order to do this, he had a ball of twine, a ball of string. And he would roll the ball of string and it would bob and weave its way through that tangled, impenetrable forest and guide his way. This is a very old idea, the ball of thread that leads the way. We see it in so many folk tales and myths. So, that arrangement, this uneasy alliance, continued for some time, with the king occasionally disappearing off into the woods, and his new queen would say, "Darling, where are you off to again?" "Oh, nothing, dear. A king, he needs to take his royal walk sometimes in the forest." Many, many uneasy marriages out there, I'm sure. But one day, the queen, she began to suspect something. The king would be away for an awfully long time sometimes, and he would always come back very, very happy, and she hated to see him happy. So one day, when the king was away, she asked around, asked some of the servants, asked some of the advisors, but everyone's lips were sealed. She knew something was up, but she had her ways. She had ways of bribery, flattery, coercion, and she managed to find one servant in particular, one among the king's household that was susceptible to kind words and maybe large helpings of the king's brandy and his own private cigars, and she managed to wheedle out of this servant where the king was going. She even managed to wheedle out of this servant the location of the king's ball of thread hidden in a chest under his bed. So, the queen, she hatched a plan. She had inherited something of the magic, the forest witchcraft of her mother, and she began to sew 7 shirts. She sewed 7 magical shirts and laced them and imbued them with magic, and she placed within them various runes and sigils and spell work, maybe kind of weights and balls of iron and bits of twig and bits of hair and toenail clippings and just parts of the old magic. And she made 7 enchanted shirts. And then, one day, she placed on one of the king's robes, hooded, and she went out into the forest with the ball of twine, which led the way through the forest directly to that hidden castle, that hidden tower deep within the forest. Now, the king's sons, they were waiting for their father to visit again. So they were of that age. They were boisterous, They went bounding out like young wolves to greet their father towards this hooded figure, because who else visits them? And as they approached, the queen, disguised as she was, threw one shirt after another, weighted shirts, boom, like nets through the air, and they landed one after the other, boom, on these boys. And as they landed, the shirts positioned themselves onto those young boys, and their necks grew long, beaks grew out of their faces, feathers grew out of their arms, and they turned to swans, one by one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 swans erupted into the sky, making that sound that swans make, and spiraled up and up and up and up. I say 6 swans because the king's daughter, the one girl, she was of that age. Perhaps you know a girl like this, perhaps you are a girl like this, perhaps you were a girl like this. She hung back. She hung back. That was her way. You know, Daddy had to come to her. You know, she liked to read a book up in the tower, whereas the boys were all rough and tumble with Dad. That was just her way. And that nature of hers on this occasion saved her, because she was there, transfixed, spellbound, as she witnessed her brothers transform into swans and fly into the shifting air above her. The queen was none the wiser, and she returned to the king's palace. I can only imagine what a horrible, lonely night that one princess had alone in the tower. And the next day, her dad arrived and she went running into his arms and he said, "What's happened? What's happened? What's happened?" And she related the whole story about the hooded figure, about the shirts, about the transformation of her brothers into swans. And the king was very, very eager to take his one remaining daughter back home to the safety of the palace. But she said absolutely not. She had a bad feeling about this. She didn't know it was her stepmother that was underneath that hood, but still, every fibre of her being was screaming, "Do not go back to the royal palace." So she said, "Please, Daddy, I just want one more night alone in the tower to say goodbye." "Fine. But keep safe, lock the door. I'm coming tomorrow morning and I'm taking you back to the palace," said the king. Fine. So, one more night she spent in that palace, just pacing around, looking at all the old games and clothing of her brothers, just wondering what she could do. She had an uneasy night, and at dawn, before her dad came to collect her, she said she made a resolution that she was going to find her brothers, and she just went off into the forest with barely the clothes on her back, off through tangled ways, over streams, through briars, just tearing her clothes, tearing her skin. Her dad, the king, arrived at the tower. He couldn't find her. He was distraught. Eventually, that princess, it was getting late now. It was approaching dusk, and she came to the shores of a great lake, and she could go no further. And she saw, a little way round the bank on the other side of the lake was a hut, maybe the hut of a woodsman or a fisherman, something like that. So she picked her way around that lake, and she found this little hut, and she found it was open, and it was abandoned. And she saw 6 little bunks in that hut. And she was so exhausted that she lay down to sleep for a few hours. She was awoken at dusk with a commotion above the lake, and she looked out the window. The sun was going down, and the surface of that lake had turned to a kind of deep molten red. And suddenly, in through the window flew 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 swans. She shrunk away into the corner, into the shadows of the room, and watched, transfixed, as those swans blew upon one another and blew all the feathers off their skin, and they became her brothers again. She screamed, she squealed with delight and could not contain herself, and ran and hugged one another. They all hugged one another. They were overjoyed, tears running down their faces. But after the ecstasy of this reunion had passed, a very sombre mood fell upon the brothers, and they said to her, "Dear, dear, dear sister, sorry to convey, but we cannot come back with you to Father's palace. We can only be human for 15 minutes a day, at sundown, at the hinge between night and day. When that 15 minutes is up, we have to become swans again and fly away. And what's more, you cannot stay the night here. This is a robber's den. When nightfall fully comes, they will come and they will kill you. You have to leave now." She said, "No, there must be something that I can do." "There is nothing," they said. "This is our fate. We are swans now for the rest of our days." And she said, there must be something. There must be. There's always something, always. Well, there is, but it's not for you to do. Well, tell me. No, it's too hard. Tell me, whatever it is, I will do it. You cannot do this. Tell me. The only thing, they said, that can save us is if someone spends 6 years weaving 6 shirts of aster flowers. And during that time, they do not speak a word. Aster flowers are very, 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 very delicate flowers. They just seem to come apart, dissolve in your hands. To weave a shirt from aster flowers? Impossible. 6 in 6 years? But that was the only spell that would break the curse they're under. And if she uttered a single word during this whole time, the spell would be broken and the shirts would fall apart. And they would be doomed to remain swans forever. I'll do it, said the sister. I'll do it. As you will, sister. The 15 minutes was up. Feathers grew back out of her 6 brothers, and they swarmed out of that window in a circle above the lake and away, away, away into the shifting sky. Well, that sister wasted no time. Those robbers will be back soon. She sped out into the night. She slept in a slimy hole beneath the roots of a tree somewhere. And at dawn the next day, subsisting of berries and moss, she walked through the forest and almost guided on a pathway through the forest, picking aster flower after aster flower after aster flower after aster flower. She gathered them in her arms, and near the end of that day she saw a great tree, and she rested beneath that tree and began to sew aster flowers, make a shirt. She began to make shirts from aster flower. As you can imagine, this was a long and laborious process. Many, many, many times the shirts would just come to pieces in her hands. But gradually, day by day, by week, month by month, she, in her silent, concentrated way, would begin to weave these shirts. And she would pay special attention to the area around the heart. Eventually, as time wore on, she migrated from the base of that tree up to its lower branches so she could be safe from predators, but also so she could work under the moonlight. And then she moved higher and higher and higher up that tree until she was in the very top branches, where she made herself a little nest. And she would only come down very occasionally to walk into the forest and pick more aster flowers, and then she would ascend the tree to her work. Gradually, as time went on, her fingers became more dexterous and stronger, and she became focused in her work. She didn't miss speech to begin with. She wanted to laugh and scream and sing, but now she was single-minded. She was concentrated. There was magic being woven among that tree. And you know, when that kind of focus is taking place, that kind of spell work, it attracts others. Soon animals would come from nearby trails, and they would just begin to graze or rest beneath that tree. Other things too. One day, a king came by. A king from another kingdom, kind of like maybe a chieftain of some kind. And he came by with his retinue and his huntsmen, his musicians, and he was just strangely attracted to this part of the wood. And then he looked up, and by all the world, is that not just the most beautiful young woman you have ever seen? And all his retinue agreed that it certainly was. "Oi there," said the king. "What are you doing?" Silence. "What are you doing up there?" Still silence. Maybe just an aster flower would rain down and just land on his face and then fall onto the floor. "What are you sewing?" He was so insistent, this king, because his heart, strange thing, but he was so entranced by this magical young woman sewing shirts of aster flowers at the top of this tree. And he said, "Won't you come down? Please come down. We'll have food to eat." Come down. Well, to make them go away, she took off her girdle, hello, and threw it down to the king. And he took it as a token and rode off. The next day he came back and was still trying to coax this strange flower-weaving magical maiden of the trees down. He would come back in the evening, he would come back in the day, he would come back alone, he would come back with minstrels to try and coax her, he would come back with a great revenue, he would come back with a feast and lay it down beneath, all the time trying to coax her, but she would not come down, she would not even say a word. She would occasionally just throw down a piece of clothing until she was barely wearing anything at all. Symbolism of this is very interesting. One day the king went back, alone, in a full moon. And he just spoke the true words that were in his heart. No minstrels, no feast, nothing. He just said, look, here's the deal. I love you. I don't know why, I don't even know you. But I'm absolutely in love with you. And if you want to weave your shirts out of flowers, you can do that. I accept that. All I'm saying is just come down from the tree, come back, be my queen. You never have to say a word and you can keep doing your work. I can see, I can witness that it is sacred work that you are doing. Just come down, you'll be well fed. Well, that princess, she thought for a while. And she climbed down from that tree with maybe 3 or 4 shirts made of aster flower over her arm, got on the back of that king's horse, and rode back to his kingdom. Now, when the king arrived with this strange maiden of the treetops, feelings were a little bit mixed. Many of the people were overjoyed. I mean, she was beautiful, and clearly a bit of magic of the forest had come back to heal the kingdom. But there was one person at least that was very, very displeased. It was the king's own mother. You've brought back a witch, son. She could be a peasant. Look at her flower shirts come back from the forest. What riffraff have you brought back this time? No. But the king wasn't having any of it, and they were wed. Now, and there was a great celebration, and before too long, that young princess, she was heavy with child. Now, 9 months later, she gave birth to a beautiful child. But the queen's mother, taking a dislike to this young princess, came in the night and took away the child and smeared her face with chicken's blood and spread rumours that she had eaten the child. She was a witch and a cannibal. Cannibal. But the king would have none of it. He would not believe it of his silent love. Well, what happens once in a fairy tale always happens 3 times. So 9 months later, there was another child. Same thing happened again. The king's mother came and took the child in the night, smeared the queen's face with chicken's blood. Cannibal went the cry. On the 3rd child, for the 3rd child to disappear into the ground with blood on his wife's face, the king could stand it no longer. He desperately wanted a son to succeed him, and now the murmurings in the court had grown too much. There would be outward rebellion if the king would not sentence his cannibal witch wife to death. So, that is exactly with a heavy heart what he did, and she was thrown into the deepest dungeon, awaiting her day of execution. But the king, he still loved her, and when she asked if she could just take her shirts of aster flower into the dungeon with her, he of course agreed. And even in a sliver of light coming from the bars high above, she was still weaving aster flowers into shirts. And even on the day of her execution, when the gates of the jail were drawn open and she was placed on a cart raised high with kindling and firewood, she still had 5 shirts of aster flower over her arm, and she was still putting the finishing touches just on the sleeve of the last shirt with aster flower. And all the time, though the crowd jeered at her, called her names, called her a witch, a cannibal, all the things you can think of, she still silently, with power and serenity, wove that last shirt together, and then she was placed on the pyre, fully accepting her fate. She had her work to do. The brazier was being brought forward, and she was just about to be burned alive at the stake. But you need to know, at that moment, 6 years to the day had been complete. And as she turned her face skywards, she saw against the sky 6 swans fly out of the horizon and then come low over the crowd, making an awful noise. The crowd ducked. They didn't know what was going on. The swans were flying in all directions. It was chaos. And then they flew round and round and round. That princess, the queen, on that pyre, the guy with the burning torch, he leapt out the way, dodging a swan. And then as they flew past her, she threw 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 shirts onto these swans as they flew past, and then they turned into her brothers, strong, fully grown men, standing side by side, shoulder to shoulder with her sister, and not a single person dared approach. But you see, one of the shirts wasn't quite finished, and one of those brothers still had a swan's wing instead of an arm. They stood there, and then that queen, she stood up, and for the first time in 6 years, she spoke. And she said, "Now I have a voice. Now I have a story, and you all will listen to me." And she looked through the crowd and pointed her finger at the king's own mother and said, "You!" And then she unleashed the whole tale, the whole thing, right from back in the days of the tower, when she'd seen her brothers transformed into swans, the tale about her exile in the forest, all the times the queen's mother had come into her bedchamber and stolen her child and smeared her own face with blood, and she could say nothing, because of the spell she was under and the enchantment and her duty to her brothers. But now, oh, now she would say words. Well, the whole crowd were in uproar, and they immediately grabbed the king's mother and put her on the pyre instead and set her alight, and she screamed and burned alive. And those six brothers, they turned into marvelous young kings of their own, except for that one with the swan's wing. He went on a long, long journey, and where he is now, I cannot say. But the queen herself, she had the power of speech. She had the power of song. She had the power of story. And when she spoke, people listened. When she spoke, wisdom dropped like pearls from her mouth. And it was a happy, happy, happy day in the kingdom. And my friends, I can't tell you what happened to those 3 children, that were stolen away. Maybe they were found unharmed. Maybe their bones were found in the king's mother's garden. I do not know. I do not know what happened in the old palace. I do not know what happened in the old kingdom. But I do know, my friends, that to have a swan's wing is to be connected strongly with the other side. So, my friends, do you know anyone with a swan's wing? Do you know anyone now who is weaving shirts of aster flower in silence? Who have you exiled to your tower in the forest? Do you know a king who is deep, deep, deep lost in the hunt in the dark, dark forest? A lot of imagery here, my friends. So as I said before, if anything is resonating with you, let me know, because this is not a story about swans or witches or princesses or kings or young princes with a swan's wing. All of the characters in this story are inside of you right now. So as I said, if anything in this story is speaking to you, just sit with that for a while and see where you are in this story, because it's a very old one and a very beautiful one. And there's clearly something of the sacred feminine in this, of the sacred of feminine silence and the feminine power of speech. And I don't just mean specifically about gender here as well. I find that so interesting, being left with a swan's wing in this. In a lot of the symbolism of our ancestors, water birds, swans, ducks, geese, moorhens, they symbolize the other world because they can travel on 3 planes. They can swim in the water, they can walk on land, and they can fly. So that's the overworld, the middle world, and the underworld. That's water. So quite a lot of the time you see kind of shamanic ritual items might have water birds on them. It's because they can transcend. So that that boy with a swan's wing, that's the prophet. So maybe you know someone, maybe you are someone with a swan's wing, and if you don't quite fit in, maybe it's because you have other work to do. Also, just the power of silence in this story, because gab, 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 gab. This is such a noisy world. Just to have 15 minutes of being a human and not a swan. Just to have 6 years of solitude, and then the power of speech that comes out of that. Sometimes I think if you just shut the hell up sometimes, then when you do have words, they carry so much more weight, and that's in this story, I think. Also, the tower in the forest. You know, what shadow aspects have you exiled to your tower in the forest? Because sometimes those things come back to bite you. In this story, maybe a slightly happier end in the end of transformation. Anyway, just some thoughts about some of the symbology in this story, but I'm sure you guys have your own thoughts as well. So I'm interested to hear what you think about this very, very, very ancient medicine story from our European folkloric heritage. As always, my friends, if you're new to this channel, please do like and subscribe. You can also follow me on Patreon if you want to support me personally. If you can give me about $3 a month just to say thank you. If you pay a little bit more money, I will send you a spoon. My partner Tamsin here is a very talented spoon carver. She is making some spoons right now. There she is. So I will send you a spoon across the sea.